What is justice? A noble concept, a sacred duty, or is it fear, carefully crafted and wielded like a blade? To understand the soul of the Ottoman Empire, its rise, its glory, and its darkness, you must begin where all empires reveal their truth, in the dungeons, in the courts, in the square, where blood-stained stone and silence speaks louder than screams. This is not just a story about punishment. It is a story about control, about empire, about the quiet but powerful ritual of fear that governed millions. And it begins with a whisper, then a scream. The foundations of fear. At its height, the Ottoman Empire spanned 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, its golden banners casting long shadows over Christian kingdoms and Islamic caliphates alike. But behind the elegant poetry of Rumi and the shimmering tiles of Topkapi Palace lay another story, one not told in manuscripts or recited in court, but etched into flesh. The Ottomans understood something fundamental about human behavior. Fear controls better than law, and punishment speaks louder than doctrine. Justice in the Ottoman world wasn't just retribution. It was a theater, not for the benefit of the condemned, but for the benefit of the crowd. Each act of punishment was a ritual, a performance intended to shape obedience, submission, and loyalty in the hearts of those watching. One wrong move against the Sultan, and your body becomes the message. Imagine this. You're in the bustling square of Constantinople, traders shouting, camels braying, the smell of spice and sweat thick in the air. But suddenly, silence spreads like smoke. People gather, children hoisted onto shoulders. In the center, a platform. On it, a man, blindfolded, bound, kneeling. You don't know his name, only that he crossed a line. And now, you're here to see what happens when you cross it. The practice of eye gouging wasn't unique to the Ottomans, but they perfected its symbolism. In Ottoman legal philosophy, the eye was more than a sensory organ. It was the window to one's moral compass, the channel through which temptation entered and rebellion was observed. Take away a man's eyes, and you take away not just his vision. You rip out his agency, his power, his participation in the world. Historical accounts tell us that punishments were rarely carried out in secret. The condemned was bound in the public square. A crowd would gather, some out of fear, others from sick curiosity. Then the instrument, a heated dagger, or sometimes a sharpened metal rod, glowing red, hissing in the wind. The executioner, often called the justice hand, would not speak. He would simply act. The screams echoed off stone walls. But the silence afterward, that was the real punishment. Blindness meant more than darkness. It meant dependence. It meant disgrace. For many, it was a punishment worse than death. Evliya Çelebi, a famed Ottoman traveler and chronicler, once wrote of such spectacles in his travelogues, describing how men who once commanded armies or defied taxes now begged in shadows, eyeless and broken. They were made into living monuments of imperial discipline. While eye gouging was about ongoing suffering, beheading was about finality, swift, surgical, and public. It was also deeply ceremonial. Beheading wasn't done in rage. It was done with precision, with protocol, and in some cases, with flair. When the Ottoman court declared a man guilty of treason, embezzlement, heresy, or betrayal, his fate was sealed not just in law, but in spectacle. A well-known execution happened in the 14th century. Sheikh Bedreddin, a mystic turned rebel who challenged the Sultan's power in the name of social justice. He rallied peasants and dreamers with utopian promises. When the Sultan's soldiers crushed the rebellion, bedridden, was brought to Constantinople. But rather than a swift, anonymous execution, his death was a carefully orchestrated affair. The execution square was packed. The executioner, a master swordsman, sharpened his blade in view of the crowd. A religious prayer was read aloud. Then, silence. One strike. The crowd gasped, a moment of awe, followed by cheers or terrified whispers. His head was paraded through the Capitol, displayed not as a trophy, but as a warning. Justice was not only about ending lives, it was about reshaping them. The nose, as strange as it may sound today, was once a symbol of honor and identity. In the Ottoman Empire, slicing off a person's nose was a clear and permanent mark of disgrace. It wasn't done for murder. It wasn't done for theft. It was reserved for shame, adultery, blasphemy, betrayal. Particularly for women, rhinotomy was a sentence worse than exile. In a society where family honor was everything, a woman who bore the visible disfigurement of nose cutting was seen as a fallen being, unworthy of respect, marriage, or even pity. Some husbands were forced to carry it out themselves. Yes, you heard that right. Imagine discovering infidelity, then being ordered by law to disfigure the person you once held at your side. It was brutality disguised as justice, and it was effective. Ottoman punishment didn't just silence disobedience, it weaponized humiliation. The victim became their own billboard, a walking lesson for the masses. Not all punishments ended with death or disfigurement. Some condemned souls were sentenced to something arguably worse, a slow death, a forgotten death, a death beneath the sun and the whip and the weight of an oar. Welcome to the galleys. Ottoman ships ruled the Mediterranean, but their power wasn't just in iron or sail, it was in muscle, convict muscle. Criminals of every variety, thieves, drunks, rebels, heretics, were sentenced to galley labor for a year, 5, sometimes life. Their wrists were shackled to benches, their backs bled under the lash. They slept in their own filth, ate crusted bread and moldy meat, drank salt water when the fresh ran dry, and they rode. Through blistering heat, through howling storms, through battle. Many died at sea, not with a cry, but with a whisper and a slump. Some tried to escape, but there was no escape. The oar was their tombstone. The Ottomans didn't punish for pleasure. They were punished with a purpose. Punishment wasn't just about the person. It was about the system. Every blind man on the street, every disfigured woman, every head on a spike or body rotting by the road was part of a vast social message. Obey, submit, never forget. Punishment kept the machine oiled. Fear was the grease that turned the wheels of empire. Even in the royal court, whispers of punishment kept powerful men in check. Viziers watched their words. Governors censored their tongues. Every servant knew the story of the red sherbet, where a single sip meant the difference between life, exile, or the sword. What is justice when wielded like a scythe? What happens when pain becomes a policy? The Ottoman Empire built one of the most powerful states in human history, but beneath its domes and minarets lay a secret etched into flesh, carved into the soul. This was just the beginning. The body as battlefield, whips, flames, and the breaking of will. What does it mean to own a body, to walk freely, to lift your hands, to run from fear? Now imagine that power taken, not by death, but by pain, by punishment that does not kill you, but rewrites you. In the Ottoman Empire, justice was not limited to judgment. It was a ritual, a conversion, a transformation. When you were punished, your flesh became the battleground, your soul collateral. This chapter dives into the empire's most intimate excruciating punishments, the ones that didn't always kill, but always changed forever. It was called the kurbac, a whip, simple in shape, terrifying in effect, fashioned from dried leather, sometimes from the hide of a hippopotamus or a rhinoceros. It wasn't a farmer's tool. It was a symbol of imperial control, used in the fields, on the roads, inside courts, and deep within dungeons. This was not random cruelty, it was systematic, structured. Tax collectors used the kurbac to persuade payments from reluctant farmers. Labor foremen wielded it to discipline unpaid workers building the Sultan's roads, mosques, and aqueducts. Military officers cracked it to break rebellious soldiers, and executioners used it to soften the body for worse. The kurbac wasn't just pain, it was policy. It could peel flesh in sheets, raise welts that oozed and festered. It could fracture ribs if swung with skill. Sometimes, after a flogging, victims were forced to march back to labor, or trial, or worse. This wasn't torture to extract the truth, it was a punishment to assert dominance. In Egypt and Sudan especially, the peasant labor class, the fellahin, knew the whip like a second shadow. It was so legal, so normalized, that in the 1830 Penal Code, its use was codified. Justice with a handle. Some punishments left scars, others left ghosts. The falaka was a method so simple, yet so devastating, it survived centuries. Imagine being forced to lie face down, your legs raised and tied, your bare soles exposed. Then the beating begins, not with a whip, but with rods, canes, metal-reinforced sticks. The soles of the feet are among the most sensitive areas on the human body, dense with nerves, and yet strong enough to take brutal punishment without breaking. That made them the perfect target. Authorities could punish someone brutally, without permanent, visible scars. A diplomat beaten with the falaka could still attend court the next day. But walking? That could take weeks. Some never walked again. Victims screamed, fainted. Some suffered from nerve damage so intense their feet would never fully heal. In schools, children were whipped this way for talking back. In prisons, it was used to extract confessions. On military grounds, it was used to enforce obedience. If the whip was the language of control, the falaka was its punctuation mark, and no one escaped its grammar. Some punishments were not about pain. They were about erasure. In the Ottoman Empire, masculinity was power. It was lineage. It was authority. To lose that was to be removed from history itself. Emasculation was the cutting away of manhood, literally, the genitals removed. It was reserved for enemies of the state, threats to the throne, slaves. It made a man harmless, unable to produce heirs, unable to reclaim status, to challenge dynasties. For some, like captured enemy commanders or political prisoners, it was the final humiliation. For others, like the eunuchs of the imperial harem, it was a job requirement. The eunuchs of the Ottoman court were among the most powerful men in the empire. Ironically, they held power precisely because they were perceived as safe. No family ties, no ambitions of lineage, no sexual threat. Some, like the chief black eunuch, controlled entire palace sectors, including the Sultan's harem. They issued orders, handled royal correspondence, governed provinces by proxy. But behind the veil of power was deep personal tragedy. They were not whole, not free, and never remembered with legacy. Some punishments were beyond control. They were spectacle. Flaying was one of the most horrifying of all. The skin removed while alive, often starting at the scalp, moving down piece by piece. Executioners were skilled. They followed muscle lines, used sharp knives, boiled water to soften tissue, made it easier to peel. The goal was not death, at least not immediately. The goal was pain, drawn out, magnified. Death came later, by shock, by infection, or by sheer mercy of the body shutting down. In rare cases, the skin was hung beside the body, as if to say, "This man was once whole. Look what defiance brings." And then there was boiling, kazan katma, death by cauldron, used especially for poisoners, traitors, palace officials, slowly dipped into boiling oil or water, inch by inch, flesh melting, nerves screaming. It was theater, with heat, with screams, with steam rising into the air like incense to angry gods. This wasn't about rehabilitation. It was about fear, the kind that ripples through generations. Every lash, every scream, every disfigured face walking the street, they weren't just punishments. They were messages. Fear was the currency of empire. By turning pain into public ritual, the Ottomans kept millions in check. People obeyed not out of loyalty but out of terror. They saw the blind man on the corner. They heard the stories of flayed rebels. They knew the eunuch who could order a death but never hold a child. They felt the cold steel of the kurbak even if it never touched them. Pain was a language, and the empire spoke it fluently. And yet, this was only the surface. There were punishments more secret, more ritualized, and even more twisted. When pain is not just a sentence but a design, when the human body is not sacred but strategic, what kind of world does that build? A world where control is absolute and resistance unthinkable. Hooked yet? Just wait. What's coming next will blow your mind. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating history. The theater of pain, impalement, drowning, and the spectacle of submission. When the drums stopped beating and the torches dimmed, the crowd held its breath. The air was thick with anticipation, fear even. For those who gathered in the Ottoman Empire's public squares, execution was not merely a punishment, it was a performance, a theater of obedience. The price of disobedience wasn't just death. It was annihilation in its most creative, most visible, most traumatizing form. This chapter takes us to the center stage of Ottoman horror, the execution grounds. Here, pain wasn't inflicted in private. It was paraded like a sacred ritual. And among these dreadful displays, few methods matched the raw psychological terror of impalement, drowning, and sawing, a triad of terror that turned punishment into propaganda. Imagine a sharpened wooden pole, slick with old blood, tilted toward the sky. A man stripped naked, writhes and screams as his body is slowly forced downward, the spike piercing him from below, threading through muscle, organs, and bone. The Ottomans didn't invent impalement, but they mastered its use as psychological warfare. This form of execution, horrifyingly slow and agonizing, was deployed selectively for traitors, rebels, or those who dared challenge the Sultan's divine rule. The victim could survive for hours, sometimes days, his body skewered yet clinging to life. Executioners, trained to avoid vital organs, would carefully position the stake to prolong the suffering. Villagers watched. Children were sometimes forced to attend. No detail was spared, no cruelty withheld. This wasn't just to punish one man, it was to break the spirit of thousands. The message was brutal: defy the empire, and your body will be nailed to history. The Bosphorus shimmered under moonlight. A small boat rocked gently, and inside it, a sack writhed. Inside that sack, a woman, bound, weighted, and helpless. Sack drowning was a punishment largely reserved for women, particularly those in the Sultan's harem. Infidelity, real or imagined, could lead to a quiet but cruel execution. No blood, no fire, just a sack, a stone, and the sea. One of the most infamous incidents occurred during the reign of Sultan Ibrahim I, known as Ibrahim the Mad. In a fit of paranoia, he ordered over 280 women from his harem drowned in the Bosphorus. The reason? He suspected infidelity, though history offers no evidence. This massacre wasn't about justice. It was about control, madness, and the unchecked power of a man who ruled with whims instead of laws. But from that ocean of death, a single story survived. A woman, by sheer chance, was rescued by a passing French ship. Her tale of harem life, of brutality, of survival, spread through Europe like wildfire, shocking and tantalizing Western readers. Her voice was rare, but it was enough to expose a practice shrouded in silence. Of all the methods of execution in Ottoman records, sawing is perhaps the most grotesque. Picture it. The victim is suspended, limbs bound. A massive two-man saw is pulled back and forth, not through wood, but through flesh. Sometimes the cut began at the head, other times at the waist. The saw tore through skin, then sinew, then bone, slowly, mercilessly. In some cases, the condemned were hanged upside down. Blood rushed to their head, prolonging consciousness. They were made to watch in fragments, their disassembly. Testa el kesme, they called it, cutting with the saw. It wasn't used often. It didn't need to be. Like impalement, it was a ritual of fear, reserved for crimes so severe, treason, sacrilege, assassination. It was used to carve morality into the minds of all who witnessed it. And people did witness. The square was packed. No scream was too loud, no moment too long. If fear is a teacher, then this was the lecture. The horror of these executions cannot be separated from the audience. The Ottomans knew that pain loses its power if hidden, so they laid it bare. The square became a theater. Children learned obedience by watching bodies fall. Women wept. Men clutched their beads. These punishments worked, not just because they killed, but because they taught. They taught silence, they taught submission, and above all, they taught that the Sultan's justice was not to be questioned. Across the vast Ottoman lands, from Constantinople to Aleppo to Cairo, execution was woven into the fabric of civic life. It was the Sultan's exclamation point. The gallows loomed not just as tools of death, but as monuments to power. Each drop of blood was a verse in the empire's anthem, each scream a warning. Yet the Ottoman system was not uniquely cruel for its time. Other empires, Rome, Persia, Ming China, medieval Europe, employed similar spectacles. What set the Ottomans apart was the elegance with which brutality was woven into statecraft. Every execution had choreography. Every punishment had a purpose. But behind the spectacle, behind the propaganda, there were people. Mothers, daughters, fathers, lovers. Not just criminals, but cautionary tales. And as we stand centuries removed from these events, the silence of the dead still echoes. It asks us, what kind of justice thrives on pain? What kind of peace demands blood? This was the theater of Ottoman punishment. No curtain calls, no applause, only bones and memory. In the next chapter, we descend into quieter, more insidious forms of pain, where cruelty hid behind law, and the body was broken not with blades, but with routine. Prepare yourself for the whisper of the whip, the scream behind closed doors, and the tortures that left no mark, yet shattered lives forever. Pain and permanence, amputation, flogging, and mutilation in Ottoman justice. In the long and haunted corridors of Ottoman justice, few punishments left as permanent a mark, both physically and psychologically, as mutilation. Where impalement and boiling were spectacles designed for deterrence through death, amputation, flogging, and facial mutilation were intended to carve lessons into living flesh. These were not just acts of violence, they were living sentences. The body itself became a scroll on which the empire wrote its messages of order, control, and consequences. The Ottomans inherited and refined a long tradition of physical punishment that aimed to police not only action, but identity. The physical self, limbs that stole, the lips that blasphemed, the face that defied decorum, was a canvas of correction. For a state keen on maintaining rigid social, political, and religious hierarchies, the body was both the problem and the solution. If a man betrayed the Sultan, his head was taken. If he merely disobeyed, then his feet or hands might suffice. Amputation in the Ottoman Empire was far more than a physical punishment. It was a public demonstration of law and morality, sanctioned under both secular authority and religious jurisprudence. Thieves, deserters, and traitors were among those who could lose a hand, a foot, or both, depending on the gravity and frequency of the offense. Under Islamic law, repeated theft could result in the removal of the right hand, a punishment that was echoed in the empire's judicial code. However, unlike the swift and often clean beheadings reserved for high-ranking criminals, amputation was messy. The executioner's blade might have been sharp, but there was no guarantee of a clean cut. Bones shattered, tendons snapped, and blood soaked the ground of city squares as crowds watched the event unfold. Sometimes cauterization would follow to stop the bleeding, a red-hot iron applied directly to the stump. The pain was unimaginable, but survival was common. What lingered wasn't just the physical absence of a limb, but the social exile it signified. An amputee was often viewed not just as a criminal who had paid his price, but as one who wore his shame like a permanent badge. Employment, marriage, and social reintegration became nearly impossible. In this way, amputation was not just about justice, it was about branding. Flogging existed in two worlds, as punishment and as discipline. It was one of the most versatile tools in the Ottoman punitive repertoire, used in prisons, military barracks, schools, and fields. The weapon of choice was often the kurbak, a thick leather whip made from hippopotamus or rhinoceros hide. Unlike thinner whips designed for speed and sting, the kurbak was built to maim. Floggings were tailored to the offender. A soldier who disobeyed orders might receive a set number of lashes on the back. A laborer who failed to meet his quota could be whipped in public, often while bound to a post or tree. The most harrowing variation was reserved for peasants conscripted into forced labor projects. These men, known as falahin, were often lashed across the legs and back until they bled through their clothes and into the dirt. The lash was often followed by lime or salt water to clean the wound, a process that had the added effect of inducing excruciating pain. The whip was more than an object, it was a philosophy. It communicated dominance, it broke spirits. It was the Sultan's voice, speaking through leather and sinew. And when it came down in front of a crowd, it said one thing clearly: obedience was not optional. Among the most psychologically devastating punishments in Ottoman society was facial mutilation, particularly rhinotomy, the cutting off of the nose. This was no accident of brutality, but a deliberate act designed to erase not just a person's social status, but their very identity. A nose is not merely an organ. It's a defining feature of the human face. Its removal was as symbolic as it was disfiguring. Rhinotomy was commonly employed against women accused of adultery, or men who had committed offenses considered both shameful and politically disruptive. The punishment was intimate and public. In some cases, the husband was forced to perform the mutilation himself. The implication was profound. The act not only shamed the woman, but transferred the psychological trauma to the man, who became both victim and enforcer of patriarchal justice. In some religiously tense areas of the empire, rhinotomy was used against those who crossed faith lines, converts who had married outside their religion or had apostatized. By defacing them, the state declared that they were no longer welcome in either community. They were exiles in place, marked, isolated, and forgotten. Even children were not spared the harsh disciplines of the Ottoman justice system. The faka, a punishment involving caning the soles of the feet, was commonly used in schools and religious institutions. To modern sensibilities, punishing children with such severity might seem unfathomable, but in the context of Ottoman discipline, it was seen as necessary moral instruction. The pain inflicted by the faka was intense and often left children unable to walk for days. Feet are rich in nerve endings, and when struck repeatedly with a metal or wooden rod, the result was not just bruising, but deep internal bleeding, nerve damage, and trauma. Some children suffered permanent damage. But what made this method especially cruel was its social performativity. Students were punished in front of their peers, humiliated, broken, and reshaped. It was discipline as theater. The children who watched learned a clear lesson. Disobedience did not just lead to pain, it led to alienation. And so the cycle continued. All of these punishments shared a common goal: to make the individual a vessel for a collective lesson. The Ottomans did not simply punish, they orchestrated punishment. Whether through amputation, flogging, facial mutilation, or foot caning, every act was layered with symbolism and spectacle. It is easy in hindsight to see such methods as barbaric, but to the Ottoman rulers, these were instruments of control, not cruelty, at least not primarily. To them, order required obedience, and obedience required fear. Where written laws failed, the body became the law. Yet in these broken bodies and shattered lives, we find something deeper than mere violence. We find a system obsessed with permanence, one where pain didn't end with the act, but echoed through every step, every glance, and every attempt to rebuild a life under the shadow of scars. This was not just punishment. It was memory, etched in flesh. And it walked the streets of Constantinople long after the whip had fallen silent. The scepter of fear, power, pain, and the public eye. Throughout its reign, the Ottoman Empire built a reputation for grandeur, military supremacy, and an uncompromising system of justice. But at the heart of that justice was a philosophy that revolved not just around control, but spectacle. The final component of Ottoman punishment was its theatricality. This chapter explores how public executions, tortures, and symbols of suffering were used not only to punish, but to perform. The empire's methods turned city squares into stages and pain into political theater. The whip was not merely a tool of enforcement, it was the scepter of fear. Constantinople's sprawling markets were not only places of trade, they were where society bore witness to the power of the state. When a person was sentenced to death or punishment, it was rarely in silence or solitude. The Ottomans understood that the visual impact of pain was more effective than the whispered threat of it. Executions were events. From the Grand Bazaar to the city's ancient gates, crowds gathered for hangings, floggings, or amputations. The goal was twofold: enforce justice and implant terror. Theatrics mattered. Executioners wore distinct garments. Drummers might beat rhythmically before a hanging. A crier would announce the crimes committed, and the gathered populace, men, women, and even children, would listen as justice was meted out before their very eyes. But this wasn't just about obedience. It was a visual textbook. The bleeding body, the sobbing convict, the pooling blood, these were warnings more effective than any decree. The Ottoman use of impalement was rare, but devastatingly memorable. Reserved for traitors, saboteurs, and the gravest criminals, this punishment took center stage in the empire's theater of dread. The process was deliberate. The victim's legs were often bound, and a stake, blunt to prolong agony, was carefully inserted. With precision, it pierced through the body, rising up from the groin or abdomen, and sometimes exiting from the mouth, back, or chest. A skilled executioner could keep the impaled person alive for hours, even days. There were accounts, some perhaps exaggerated, of victims languishing, gasping, eyes fluttering as their organs failed, the pain stretching minute by minute. And always there was an audience. Villagers, traders, travelers, all passed by, watching a living body turned into a grotesque totem. For many, it became an image that haunted them for life. For the empire, it was a success. A man on a stake became a pillar of propaganda. In the realm of royal betrayal, few punishments were as terrifying as Kazan Katma, execution by boiling. This was punishment reserved for palace treachery. Cooks, food tasters, poisoners, and those accused of betrayal within the palace grounds faced a death that was as horrifying as it was symbolic. Large iron cauldrons were prepared in full public view. Oil or water was heated to impossible temperatures, and then the condemned was slowly lowered into it, not dropped, not flung. Slowly, inch by inch. The sizzle of skin meeting boiling liquid, the muffled screams, and the rising steam served as proof. The Sultan's inner circle was not beyond punishment. In fact, the closer you were to power, the more spectacular your fall. Palace staff reportedly trembled when errors were suspected. A single dish that displeased the Sultan could result in accusations of poisoning. The boiling pot, then, was not only a punishment, it was the ultimate test of loyalty, and the empire's paranoia made flesh. Testere il kesme, sawing, was not a punishment easily forgotten. Executed publicly, the condemned was often tied upside down, the blood rushing to their brain to keep them conscious longer. Two men, each holding one end of a long, coarse saw, would begin from the crotch or torso and move upward or downward, depending on the desired message. The audience was key. This was not just about killing, it was about making an example. As saw teeth ripped through bone and sinew, as the victim thrashed and screamed, the watching masses understood. Defying the Sultan was an act paid for, not just in blood, but in prolonged, witnessed agony. What did it say to the child clutching his mother's shawl? To the merchant selling figs nearby? That the state would not be trifled with. That betrayal was a slow, splintering road to the afterlife. The fate of women in the Ottoman Empire was often determined by both personal suspicion and the whims of powerful men. For concubines, disobedient wives, or those accused of betrayal, sack drowning was a method both symbolic and efficient. Bound, silenced, and sewn into weighted sacks, women were taken to the Bosphorus and dropped into its cold, dark waters. Most sank instantly. But legend speaks of one woman who didn't, rescued by a French ship. Her tale echoed through Europe, exposing the silent terrors of the Ottoman harem. Sack drowning was terrifying in its silence. There were no cries, no blood, just bubbles. And that was the point. The disappearance of the accused was as meaningful as any execution. She was erased, unpersoned, forgotten by history, if not for the rare survivor who made the world remember. Public punishment in the Ottoman Empire wasn't merely a disciplinary act. It was a policy. These weren't the uncoordinated outbursts of cruel men, but the calculated rituals of a regime determined to rule with certainty. From the hammering of flesh on the whip's edge to the eerie silence of a body swinging from a gallows, every drop of blood told a story. The order must be kept. Obedience must be ensured. Terror, when necessary, must become law. In examining the specter of fear, these spectacles of suffering, we understand a chilling truth. Violence was not a side effect of empire, but its currency. Through these public punishments, the Ottoman rulers controlled not only the body but the mind, not only the present, but the memory of generations. Today, in museums and archives, these stories echo not to glorify horror, but to remember it, so that we never forget the price of unchecked power, the cost of spectacle, and the enduring strength of those who survived it. Thank you for diving into this chilling tale from history. If it gripped you, like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. What dark story should we uncover next? Stay curious, stay vigilant, for history, like pain, leaves marks.